When a regulated financial institution collapses, investigators rarely find it lacked a written policy. The manuals are pristine, and board packs hundreds of pages long. This points to a specific executive vulnerability, the assumption that a signed policy document equates to a functioning control system. Regulators like the Central Bank of the UAE and the Securities and Commodities Authority no longer audit the mere existence of a governance framework. They audit its daily execution. They look for hard evidence of how those policies alter frontline behavior. This diagram outlines the severe disconnect between formal corporate structures and actual operating discipline. Notice the top section. This represents formal governance. Meetings happen on schedule, papers circulate, directors nod, and binders receive an approved stamp. Yet these actions occur without generating any friction or evidence of rigorous challenge. Now look at the bottom sequence. This is what live operational discipline requires. A compliance officer actively intervenes. Live dashboards highlight anomalies in real time. Daily embedded audits track exactly who made what decision. A board can set a theoretical risk appetite, but until that appetite translates into mechanical, auditable limits for a branch manager or a credit officer, it provides zero protection. The true measure of an institution's risk culture is very often found in the middle layers of management. How often they tolerate operational exceptions reveals the actual rules the firm plays by. Relying on static documents while ignoring how those documents are executed leaves an institution entirely blind. By the time conduct risks mature into regulatory penalties, the approved paperwork is irrelevant. A board of directors does not manage daily operations. Their mandate is highly specific. They direct the strategy, oversee its execution, challenge the underlying assumptions, and document the rationale for their decisions. If a committee meets for 2 hours, reviews a management proposal, and adjourns without producing a single revision or documented request for further evidence, that meeting failed. It represents passive receipt of information, not active oversight. Mature boards divide their workload into a specific committee architecture with 5 core pillars. Effective control starts with a clear mandate, dictating a targeted agenda focused on emerging risks. This produces formal minutes capturing specific dissent, which map directly to a challenge log and formal escalation protocol. A boardroom where every proposal meets rapid, unanimous agreement is not a sign of efficiency. It is a primary indicator of a passive, disengaged board failing to test management's assumptions. True corporate governance requires friction. It exists only when an external reviewer can trace a hostile, auditable paper trail of difficult questions mapping to explicit follow-up actions. Between the board's strategy and the frontline's reality sits the translation layer, senior management. This 5-step framework converts strategy into daily decisions. It starts with defined delegated authority, paired with rigid triggers forcing issues upward upon breach. An explicit RACI matrix links C-suite executives to targeted operational risks. Finally, when controls fail, a mandatory 30, 60, or 90-day remediation clock starts. A time-bound remediation deadline with an assigned owner creates safety. An open-ended assurance from management that an issue will be fixed later creates a compounded systemic vulnerability. Without explicitly mapped RACI ownership and forced remediation clocks, board directives evaporate into operational noise. Unresolved vulnerabilities persist, quietly accumulating risk. Systemic control failures frequently occur when the people executing trades or approving loans are the same people checking the validity of those actions. Risk mitigation requires strict structural independence. The 3 lines model maintains strict separation. Business units own operational risk. Their responsibility to execute daily controls is non-transferable. Risk and compliance sets frameworks and aggressively challenges the first line without operating controls themselves. Finally, internal audit provides objective assurance, reporting directly to the board to protect independence. A catastrophic accountability gap emerges if the second line steps in to perform the first line's duties. If compliance officers start executing business checks, ownership blurs, and the organization loses its independent challenge mechanism. Any overlap in these 3 distinct lines guarantees failure. It creates unowned risks, duplicate testing, and critical regulatory blind spots that mask underlying instability. Structural compliance architecture handles the theoretical design of risk, but an institution's actual exposure is dictated by the unpredictable behavioral reality of its workforce. Look left. The solid green boundary represents the rigid risk appetite approved by the board. The dotted red line represents real behavior, constantly testing the limit. Now, pan right. When a culture routinely tolerates operational overrides, like temporary breach post-it notes, formal limits are entirely invalidated. If a Treasury desk breaches its foreign exchange limits 3 times in a month and management accepts it as standard practice, the limit ceases to exist. It devolves from a hard control into a mere suggestion. C-suite executives write rules, but this flowchart maps how top-down pressure morphs into frontline habits. Middle managers transmit the actual operational culture. Focus on the center box. Stretch targets incentivize managers to bypass formal systems, issuing informal hallway approvals to meet month-end numbers. What a middle manager decides to ignore or reward on a random Tuesday dictates the institution's true risk exposure far more accurately than any board-approved PDF. Theoretical risk limits offer zero protection if they are severed from frontline execution. A policy without a mechanism for forced escalation is a dead document. This diagram maps the continuous loop of risk governance. Tracing the downward flow, executive strategy must convert into explicit operational risk limits. Following the upward return arrows, the loop closes. Breached limits must trigger immediate investigation and mechanical escalation to the board. Consider this governance stress test for your own organization. Can you take any written policy and trace it directly to an individual operational owner operating under a documented RACI mandate? Furthermore, when a frontline control fails, does your organization respond by triggering a strict remediation timeline, or does it default to defensive silence and informal workarounds? Robust governance is never measured by the sheer volume of compliant paperwork. It's measured by auditable actions, forced immediate escalation, and disciplined consequences.